Galen developed a holistic program of medical practice. He felt that the brain was the rational soul and the center of sensations and reason. Then Middle Ages came, and it was a return to supranaturalism. Probably it was the response to highly turbulent, frightening and stressful times during the Black Plague, when many people died. It was the times of numerous wars. So the focus of supranatural influences to explain events, including illness and health, became common. Insanity, mental disorders, was caused by spiritual matters such as influence of demons, witches, sin. Treatment was purely spiritual. Confession for sins, exorcism, prayer. Some insane people were, for example, chained to church walls to benefit from prayer. Some, as you see on this small picture, were tortured. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII approved the persecution of witches. Among them, we are now sure, many insane, poor creatures, mostly women, were killed. Nowadays, probably we would diagnose in majority of them either psychotic disorders like schizophrenia. Nowadays, we see in our everyday practice patients with hallucinations and delusions with the content of religion, of the contact with Satan. I remember a female patient who hallucinated having sexual intercourse with Satan, and so on and so on. And another possible diagnosis in such witches could be conversion disorder, histrionic disorder, hysteria. In such conversion disorders, we have difficult to explain symptoms due to psychological problems. This could be some examples of so-called stigmata diaboli. Of course, not everybody believed in supranatural causes of mental disorder. For example, St. Thomas Aquinas reasoned that the soul was unable to become sick, and therefore mental illness must have a physical cause. During the Renaissance, renewed interest in the physical and medical worlds emerged. Interest in mind and soul were considered unscientific and thus relegated to theologists, philosophers, priests. The emphasis on scientific observation and experimentation provided a model for future research and teaching. The biological side of the integrative biopsychosocial perspective was emphasized. And then the dualism was born with the name of René Descartes, French philosopher, who argued that the mind and body were separated. And I must say that no philosophical concept has been as widely influential in the field of psychiatry. This dualism of mind and body became the basis for Western medicine and Western psychiatry until recently. Now I would like to very shortly describe two dualism in the field of psychiatry. First will be the dualism neurology and psychiatry. Psychiatry was born to treat non-organic disorders, functional disorders like psychotic disorders, neurotic disorders, where structural background usually was not known. In contrast, neurology developed to treat organic illness with defined damage like stroke, tumor. But also in 19th century, neurologists treated so-called nervous disorders. Nowadays we would call them neurotic disorders, but it had different cause why it happened so. People with neurotic disorder were very afraid to go to psychiatrists because, as you remember, we had big psychiatric hospitals, big asylums with horrible conditions, and being psychiatric patients was really like a great stigma. It was much better to go to neurologists. And such nervous disorders were treated in sanatoriums, were treated with rest, refreshment, massage, and so on and so on. Nowadays, such dichotomy between neurology and psychiatry is not further valid. First is that purely neurological disorder cause behavioral and emotional disturbances. For example, Huntington disease. In Huntington disease, we have severe movement disturbances, but together with them, we had severe emotional and behavioral disturbances, like severe depression, like psychotic symptoms, and the main cause of the premature death of patients with Huntington disease is suicide. Then we have, for example, peak disease. It means frontotemporal dementia. The first symptoms of frontotemporal dementia would be changes in personality. Then damage in certain brain regions, especially frontal lobes, may cause mainly not neurological symptoms, but mainly personality changes, changes in behavior. On the other hand, there are more and more data about structural changes in purely psychiatric disorders, like major depression, bipolar disorder, or schizophrenia. However, the absence of detectable structural changes does not rule out the possibility that more subtle but nonetheless important biological changes are occurring. These changes may be simply nowadays before the level of detection with still limited techniques available today. And maybe in the future we will be able to see much more from disturbances of brain structure. Thus, this dichotomy is not further valid, and we observe the birth of neuropsychiatry, medical section that may unite psychiatry and neurology, and I am persuaded that the future of psychiatry, with its still limited research, with its still limited progress, so the future of psychiatry is in neuropsychiatry. Within psychiatry itself, also we observed dualism. It was dualism between somatic and psychosocial school. When I started my training in psychiatry, I was taught that there were two psychiatry. Small psychiatry, we dealt with psychogenic disease, treated mainly by psychotherapy, and great big psychiatry, we dealt with psychotic disorders, endogenous disorders like schizophrenia or cyclophrenia, now we call it bipolar disorder, and the main treatment was pharmacotherapy. Today, we know that in endogenous disorders, psychological factors, environmental factors are also very important, and psychotherapy may be very helpful. On the other hand, now we treat purely neurotic disorders with medication. But the dualism developed in the 19th century. On one hand, we had advances in physiology and pathology of brain, and somatic school was born, and that somatic school understood that psychiatric disorders were a result of somatic changes in the brain. On the other hand, developed psychology as an independent branch of science, and psychological school emerged. Such people understood that psychiatric disorders were the result of psychosocial factors. One of the milestones in psychosomatic school was what we learned about cell biology, cellular biology from, for example, Rudolf Virchow, or germs from Louis Pasteur. One of the main causes of psychiatric hospitalization in 19th century was neurosyphilis. And it was a milestone to understand that neurosyphilis was caused by microorganisms entering the brain following sexual activity. Treatment of neurosyphilis with malarial fever was one of the first, if not the first, effective treatment in psychiatry. Because of that, Austrian psychiatrist Julius Wagner-Jorek in 1927 received Nobel Prize. Also, Emil Kraepelin, one of the main researchers in the field of psychiatry, asserted that mental disorders were brain disorders and mental illness could be classified as rising from either exogenous or endogenous influences. On the other hand, we observed the development of psychosocial school. It's worth mentioning Philippe Pinel, French psychiatrist well known for liberating patients from chains, who also started so-called moral therapy with emphasis on humanistic treatment of patients and interpersonal relationships, both between patients and between patients and medical staff. Another great doctor who was important in the development of psychological school was Roberta Sharko, who was neurologist, head of the neurology in Paris, in the hospital Salpêtrière, and who used hypnosis to treat a wide variety of conversional disorders. What does it mean? These are physical symptoms without apparent physical cause. Who used to treat hysteria with hypnosis, and one of his famous student was also neurologist from Vienna, Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud, after having his practice in Charcot unit, returned to Vienna and started to develop his psychoanalysis and psychotherapeutic school. It's important that after the Second World War in USA, psychiatry was under the great influence of psychoanalysis. It had, unfortunately, that dark side. Because of that, psychiatry was transformed from a medical discipline into a practicing therapeutic art. Psychoanalysts who really dominated in American psychiatry were against biological research in the field of psychiatry. So psychiatry became a little bit denigrated, became a little bit lower discipline of medicine than other disciplines of medicine. It's a pity because not anybody else but Sigmund Freud, who was the first to put the first stone to build up a bridge toward integration. In his project for a scientific psychology, he wrote, "What we experience as conscious or unconscious processing of information is reflected in the neuronal architecture of the brain and the nervous system in general. Look, it was written in 19th century. Speaking therapy can rearrange neuronal connections and change the character of psychological experiences. This idea will be actual now and will return with our modern neuroscientific knowledge. Once regarded as radical, those ideas were rejected by Freud's contemporaries. Because of the immaturity of brain science at that time, he abandoned this biological concept for a purely mentalistic one based on verbal reports of subjective experience. Since 1960, we observed a big progress in the field of psychiatry. First of all, it was development of effective treatments. In 1952, chlorpromazine, the first antipsychotic, appeared. It was really a revolution in psychiatric hospitals. Finally, many patients could return home. In 1959, the first antidepressant, imipramine, appeared. Then, what else? What the progress? Establishment of new clinically validated and objective criteria for diagnosing mental disorders. There was renewed interest in the biology of mental disorders, especially in the genetic of mental disorders. Major developments in brain sciences, in particular in the analysis of how different aspects of mental functioning are represented by different regions of the brain, helped us to understand better behavioral disturbances. Specific lesions of the brain produce specific alteration in behavior, and specific alteration in behavior are reflected in characteristic functional changes in the brain. And here is the time to cite Eric Kandel, Nobel Prize winner, who did his basic research on a simple model of aplysia neurons. Aplysia is a C-slug, and it has just between 10 and 20,000 of neurons, a few million times less than a human. Those neurons are much larger than mammals' neurons, and that's why they are quite easy to investigate. Kandel showed that the process of learning is associated with the increase of the number of synapses. Neuroscience has started to identify neural correlates not only of mental disorders but also of therapeutic changes. Procedural relearning in psychotherapy can influence the structure and function of the brain by altering synaptic plasticity and gene expression. There is a growing evidence of a modification of gene expression by emotional experience. It is so-called epigenetic modification. We have two important functions of our genome. First is template function, reliable replication. Usually it is not affected by environmental experience. It may be altered, of course, by mutations, but those mutations are relatively rare and random. However, equally important function is transcriptional function to determine phenotype. And this transcriptional function is highly regulated and responsive to environmental factors. Internal and external stimuli, the steps in the development of the brain, hormones, stress, learning, social interactions, alter the transcription and gene expression. This mechanism makes all body function, including brain function, accessible to social influences. This socially influenced alteration are transmitted culturally. Another fascinating field to reunion our understanding of psychotherapy with our understanding to brain function is research on memory. There was a very well-known case of the patient H.M., who was a patient with refractory epilepsy. This pure boy, a young man, had many attacks during each day. So finally, doctors decided to perform surgery, radical surgery, to remove epileptic foci. They performed bilateral removal of temporal cortex, amygdala, and 2/3 of the hippocampus of this patient. It happened in 1957, and the patient was 27 years old. After the surgery, doctors observed partial retrograde amnesia. However, anterograde amnesia was total. This man couldn't memorize and learn anything. Then he was followed and examined many times by neuropsychologist Brenda Milner, who described his behavior and interaction with him with details. She described unconscious emotional associations, who was unable to memorize anything, however, who was able to connect stimuli with emotions. For example, who was visiting his mother in hospital. Next day, he didn't remember this fact, but he had unclear feeling that something wrong happened to his mother. Once Brenda Milner, when she shook his hand, she picked him with a needle. Next day, he didn't remember neither this fact, neither this event, nor Brenda Milner. However, when she tried to shake his hand, he just removed his hand back. He didn't want to shake his hand. Of course, he was unable to explain why it is so. Studies on explicit and implicit memory showed that patients who lack explicit memory, like our patient HM, are capable of learning tasks that not require conscious awareness. People might unconsciously associate certain situations or important objects, for example, other people, with positive or negative feeling. They might unconsciously react to signals, avoid or search for situations or people who subconsciously fit the pattern of previous experience. At the same time, they are unaware of memories that left such emotional traits. Declarative explicit memory and implicit memory are associated with different brain structures, and those studies imply the neural basis for a set of unconscious mental processes, and as we know, the main change in the course of analytic psychotherapy concern this implicit memory and concern this unconscious association between, let's say, current disturbed behavior and events from early childhood or events from the past that are not currently remembered by the patient. What is really fascinating, now we can see that really Freud was right, that really psychotherapy does a change in our brains. Neuroimaginary studies, PET studies of patients with different disorders, like obsessive-compulsive disorder, like different phobias, like depression, support the hypothesis that disorders show more or less characteristic changes in regional brain activity. But what is even more fascinating, those changes in regional brain activity may be normalized by psychotherapy. Nancy Andreasen, who is a very well-known American psychiatrist, previous editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Psychiatry, biological psychiatrist. Her research concerned mainly schizophrenic patients. And he said, psychotherapy, sometimes humiliated as verbosity, in a way is as biological as pharmacotherapy. I think that now it is the time to cite some fragments of Kandel's manifesto and see that, once again, Freud was right. So principle one, all mental processes, even the most complex psychological processes, derive from operations of the brain. Principle two, genes and other protein products are important determinants of the patterns of interconnections between neurons in the brain and the details of their functioning. Genes, and especially combination of genes, therefore exert a significant control over behavior. Altered genes do not by themselves explain all the variants of a given major mental illness. Social or developmental factors also contribute very importantly. Behavior and social factors exert actions on the brain by modification of the expression of genes and thus the function of nerve cells. Learning produces alterations in gene expression. This alteration induced by learning gives rise to changes in patterns of neuronal connections. And insofar as psychotherapy or counseling is effective and produces long-term changes in behavior, it presumably does so through learning by producing changes in gene expression that alter the strength of synaptic connections and structural changes that alter the anatomical pattern. However, biological hegemony over psychological approach may imply some kind of biological reductionism, which holds that all psychological states are really brain states. Our minds are just a function of our brains, and mental states are constituted solely by brain states. Mental disorders should then be regarded as nothing other than chemical imbalances, and psychiatrists should not treat individuals but their brains. It would be the voice of biological reductionism. The most influential and prominent scientists quoted that we are our synapses, or we are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. We psychiatrists, when we reflect on this progress of neuropsychiatry, we feel that the brain is of course necessary but not sufficient to account for all the physiological and psychological properties that make each us a unique person. The mind is not based solely on brain structure and function, but on the continuous interaction of the brain with the body and with the external world. Our body shapes our perception of and psychological response to the world. A different body would change this perception and response. As environment also shapes our experience of interacting with the world and others, a different environment would result in different content and meaning of a person's experience and memory of the interaction. Thus, let's work with our imagination. If we imagine transplantation of the brain into a different body, if ever possible, probably not, but maybe, such transplantation we may expect would not preserve fully the identity of the person whose brain was transplanted. Kenneth Candler, another great American psychiatrist, most widely cited American psychiatrist in the field of genetic of schizophrenia, he wrote, "Stop searching for a big, simple explanations. We have hunted for big, simple neuropathological explanations for psychiatric disorders and have not found them. We have hunted for big, simple neurochemical explanations for psychiatric disorders and have not found them. We have hunted for big, simple genetic explanations for psychiatric disorders and have not found them." Just a short example of environment interactions, biological interactions is stress, what stress does with us. We know that stress is both biological event and activation of stress axis, but also we understand stress as purely psychological event. And stress through hormonal mechanism lead to decrease in neurogenesis, neuroprotection, neuronal survive, atrophy of neuronal projection, especially the early childhood stress. And here I have this rats and mother licking young rats, but we had a wonderful lecture of Professor Sullivan of that subject. So, just to summarize, all major psychiatric disorders are complex and multifactorial. Thus, in nowadays psychiatry, the biopsychosocial model of disorders is predominant. This perspective utilizes multidimensional and interactive approach. Biological, psychological, and social aspects of health and illness influence each other, creating ethological networks. This concept has practical impact. promoting combined therapies which match biological treatment with psychosocial intervention with psychotherapy. Many studies confirmed the efficacy of such approach and the superiority of combined treatment of most of disorders over unimodal treatment. And the last slide is a citation from Professor Antoni Kępiński, who died in 1972, and he was great Kraków psychiatry, head of our department of psychiatry. He is well known for his wonderful books about mental disorders. And he wrote, from biological point of view, the division between psyche and soma is a pure fiction. So thank you for your attention, and here is a picture of our Department of Psychiatry. Thank you for your attention.